Today I'd like to take a look at the life and times of the Byzantine Emperor Constantine IV, who ruled between 668 and 685. Constantine had the misfortune of coming between better-known emperors from his own family and of being smack dab in the 7th century, which was part of the Byzantine Dark Age, a time in which we don't really know as much as we'd like. However, we do know enough about Constantine IV to know that he was one of the most important emperors of that time, and that he achieved some fairly substantial things which were vital to the development and survival of the Byzantine world. So, without any further ado, let's look into the career of Constantine IV. Constantine IV was born in 652, and he was named co-emperor to his father Constans II in 654. One interesting thing about their relationship is that due to the paucity of information about the century in general, there was initially some confusion as to which one of them was the bearded. And for a while, some scholars were identifying Constantine IV as the bearded, when in reality it was his father Constans II who earned that nickname. Constantine had two younger brothers, Heraclius and Tiberius, and both of them were also accorded crowns while Constans II was still alive and kicking. Constantine IV, however, would be the son who inherited the throne when his father was murdered in Sicily in 668. Young Constantine IV was only 15 years old at the time of his accession. So, just like all the Heraclean emperors, Constantine IV had to face a crisis immediately upon his accession to the throne. Early in 669, the troops in Asia Minor marched from the capital, and they demanded that Constantine share power with his two younger brothers, on the grounds that it would be like the Trinity in heaven. Most likely, what they were trying to do is a divide-and-conquer strategy against the young imperial princes, trying to empower the army at the expense of the Heraclean dynasty. Constantine IV, like any Heraclean, was a natural-born autocrat, and he saw through this plot immediately. So when he met with these leaders, instead of talking with them and empowering his two younger brothers, he simply had all of these leaders executed as mutineers, which dealt with the problem pretty neatly. This incident shows Constantine's autocratic streak, which was every bit as strong as that of his father Constans II and that of his son Justinian II. And in addition, what this shows is that there was public support in one way or another for all members of the Heraclean dynasty. This dynasty had achieved legitimacy in a way that was not usual in the Byzantine world. At the same time that young Constantine was dealing with the army of Asia Minor at home, he received news that there was a usurper in Sicily. So, when Constans II was assassinated, one of his generals named Mezezius, who may or may not have been involved in the death of Constans II, declared himself emperor and managed to take control in Syracuse. He ruled there for 7 months, and he did have enough power to mint his own coin, but beyond that, it doesn't look like he was able to really seize control of the entire Byzantine West. Our sources are also divided on how the imperial forces managed to defeat Mezezius. Michael de Syrian says that Constantine IV arrived in person and fought Mezezius, but papal sources say that local forces dealt with Mezezius. If I had to guess, I would say that the papal sources were correct, simply because Constantine IV now was suspicious of his brothers after the whole Asia Minor incident, and he had bigger fish to fry than dealing with a minor usurper who wasn't even able to get the entirety of the West to back him. So it's very likely that most of the forces in the West remained loyal and managed to restore Heraclean control in the name of the absent Constantine IV. And now Constantine IV had to confront his biggest enemy, Caliph Muawiya of the Umayyad Caliphate. Muawiya was still Byzantium's most determined foe, and his forces were now pressing the Byzantine frontiers harder than they had in the past. In 668, the Byzantine general Siborius had revolted, probably against Constans, and he had invited Muawiya to help him revolt. It looks like news of Constantine's accession reached him a little bit later, but once you're in revolt, you kind of have to keep going, because then you're a traitor. So if you want to stop being a traitor, you either have to die or win. So Siborius had already cast the die there. Anyway, Siborius ended up dying in a horse accident early on, but Muawiya decided to press his advantage and try to eliminate the empire, something that he had been trying to do since his appointment as governor of Syria all the way back in 639. Muawiya recognized that the Byzantine Empire was not as strong as it had been and that it had fewer resources with which to respond to any potential threats. So he decided to attack on several fronts and hope that the Byzantines collapsed on at least one of them. His ultimate goal, however, was to capture Constantinople, which he recognized as the key to the survival of the Byzantine Empire. So he entrusted the main mission to his son Yazid, and he dispatched him deep into Anatolia, and he also dispatched another army to attack North Africa at the same time. North Africa, if you'll recall, had briefly fallen into Arab hands before this, and then the Byzantines managed to reclaim it. Now, Muawiya wants it back. So Yazid was able to penetrate all the way to Chalcedon, the city just across the straits from Constantinople itself, and he was also able to temporarily capture Amorium. In other words, Yazid and his forces were in a good position to set up shop along the coast and receive naval aid near Constantinople, which would ultimately enable them to besiege the city. Now, while this is going on the eastern front, in North Africa in 670, the Umayyads were able to overrun all of North Africa with the exception of Carthage itself, and now they have enough ports in North Africa to begin raiding into Byzantine Sicily, the former imperial seat of Constans II. And Muawiya, to his credit, was able to keep his eye on the prize, and now that he has some footholds in the heart of Byzantine territory near the capital, he is going to divert all of his efforts, or at least his main efforts, to the project of putting himself in a position to besiege Constantinople. With all of that in mind, Arab forces worked systematically to gain bases near Constantinople and provide themselves with the logistical infrastructure to sustain a large army and navy to besiege the capital of the Byzantine Empire. In 670, the Arabs were able to capture Cyzicus, and then they captured the city of Smyrna in 672. The first Arab naval attack on Constantinople occurred in 672, and that distracted Constantine IV to the degree that the Slavs were actually able to organize and lay siege to Thessalonica, a siege which went on for several years, and effectively made the second city of the empire completely useless when it came to defending the capital against the Arabs. So, now that the Arabs had all of their local bases in place, they felt able to go for a long-term, large-scale siege of the city, and they began their siege in 674. Presumably during this 4 or so year period, when they could see what was going on, the Byzantines spent their time strengthening their fortifications and building more ships to strengthen their navy to try to resist this coming siege. The Arab siege of Constantinople lasted from 674 to 678, and I don't think there's any real doubt that this was one of the key turning points in Byzantine history. So, going into the siege, Byzantium had been constantly on the decline since the Arab invasions had started. And now, for the first time, they're going to win a major victory and then begin the slow process of recovering some of their lost power. So, this siege had an intermittent nature. What would happen is that the Arab ships would arrive in the spring, lay siege, fail for the year, and then go home for winter and come back and do it all over again. It was fairly clear, at least it seems like it was clear to the attackers, that they were not going to be able to take the city as early as 674, but they continued to try anyway. The Arabs were unable to penetrate Constantinople's defenses, and they also did not succeed in starving the city out. The details of this campaign are actually fairly scanty, except for one very well-known detail that we'll talk about in greater depth momentarily. What ends up happening in the end is that the demoralized Arabs left for Syria in 678 and took their fleet with them. Unfortunately for the sailors present, they happened upon a storm while they were rounding a cape, and the vast majority of their ships were lost. At the same time, there was a near-simultaneous land battle in Lycia, which also resulted in a Byzantine victory, and that was the first major Byzantine battlefield victory against the Arabs. So, between those two events, Constantine IV is now a hero, and Byzantium's spirits and morale are also rising. So, what started out as a dark chapter where the very existence of the empire was in question turned into a time when the empire would begin this long road to recovery. Although the details of the campaign are scanty, we do know that the Siege of Constantinople from 674 to 678 was the first ever use of the fully mature version of Greek fire, and that this weapon was something that the Arabs simply could not counter. Now, there are precursors for Greek fire which date back as early as the Peloponnesian War in the 5th century BCE, but this time this Greek fire will be in its fully mature form, and it seems to have been fired from cannons on board Byzantine ships. And because of the danger that Greek fire posed to wooden ships, it's no wonder that the Arab fleet was ineffective against the fortifications of Constantinople over this 4-year period. You can imagine how frustrating this must have been if you were one of the Arab commanders and you couldn't risk a naval battle for fear of having your entire fleet go up in flames. So let's tie up some loose ends. Back in Sicily, after Mezezius had been defeated in 669, his son John had remained in Sicily and was presumably content to live as a civilian. However, most likely due to the pressures of renewed Arab attacks in the region, John decided to revolt in his own name in 678 and take up the mantle of his father. Michael the Syrian claims that the revolt also lasted for 7 months, just like Mezezius' revolt had, and then Constantine IV arrived in person and dealt with it. However, given that Constantine IV was actually dealing with the Siege of Constantinople, which was a literal life and death struggle for his empire, it's extraordinarily unlikely that he was able to find the time to go to Sicily and deal with John. But it looks like Michael the Syrian was someone who assumed that emperors had to be present at all times for anything to happen, which is not true, but an interesting assumption nonetheless. After the pair of Byzantine victories in 678, Caliph Muawiya, who was now elderly, decided that it was best to let well enough alone and end the war with the Byzantines. At home, the Umayyads also had to deal with Christian rebels from the Taurus Mountains called the Mardites, who were now raiding into Syria and Palestine and creating some havoc. So Muawiya wanted to make peace with the Byzantines and focus on the more pressing problem near to his capital at Damascus. When he agreed to peace in 679, surprisingly, Muawiya agreed to pay tribute to the Byzantines of 50 slaves, 50 horses, and 3,000 pounds of gold, and he also gave them back some of the islands that he had conquered during the time of Constans II and Constantine IV. And while you might think that this represents a major shift in power, it actually was not all that unusual for a stronger power to pay tribute to a weaker power during this period. After all, if you'll recall, the Byzantines sometimes paid tribute to the Sasanian Persians, even though the Byzantines were almost always stronger than their Persian neighbors. So don't make too much of the fact that Muawiya was willing to pay them money. Like any good Byzantine ruler, as soon as the ink was dry on his peace agreement with Muawiya, Constantine IV pitched himself wholeheartedly into ecclesiastical affairs. And this took the form of the Sixth Ecumenical Council, which was called between November 680 and September 681, to settle the issue of monothelitism once and for all. What ends up happening over the next 10 months is that the council upholds the Council of Chalcedon from 451, and they ended the monothelite controversy. One thing that really facilitated this was, ironically, that most of the people who would consider themselves to be monothelites were now living under the Umayyads, and therefore they didn't really matter too much for decisions that would only affect imperial subjects. By resolving the monothelite controversy, Constantine IV thereby actually fulfilled an ambition of Heraclius and Heraclius's heroic patriarch Sergius, who had defended the city against a Persian siege back during the Byzantine-Sasanian War. By 680 or 681, Constantine IV was at the pinnacle of his popularity. He had been the first Byzantine ruler to preside over battlefield victories against the Arabs, who up to that point had looked basically invincible. He had resolved a major ecclesiastical dispute, or at least was in the process of resolving it. And the greatest foe of the empire, Caliph Muawiya, died in 680. So it looked like the future was bright for Constantine, who was still young, and his dynasty. Around this time, Constantine IV was hailed as the light of the world, the new Constantine the Great, the new Marcian, the new Justinian, and the destroyer of heretics. And everything was looking peachy keen, and then he decided to launch a battlefield campaign against the Bulgars in the Balkans, now that he had the latitude to operate in the west and didn't have to worry about another Arab fleet trying to take his capital. And let's see how that goes. In 680, the Bulgars crossed the Danube and began to subjugate local communities. And for Constantine IV, this posed an obvious danger since it was clear that the Bulgars were forming an empire. Now, if you look at the state of the Balkans, otherwise, the Slavs had overrun most of Byzantium's territory, but for the most part, they hadn't really formed states, at least not states that could pose any kind of danger to Byzantine survival. So this is a new crisis, and Constantine IV is eager to deal with it early. So in 680, he led out his army to the Danube basin and began to lay siege to the city of Dobruja. However, it looks like the Byzantines didn't do a very good job of reconnoitering the area, and they didn't really know where all of the Bulgar armies were. And to compound things, Constantine fell ill about this time, perhaps of gout or maybe some other disease, and he left his army in the hands of his generals and returned to the capital. And then in early 681, the Bulgar forces consolidated at Dobruja and inflicted a massive defeat on the Byzantine army, which was more or less completely defeated. And the defeat was severe enough that Constantine IV was forced to acknowledge Bulgarian control of the former province of Mysia. The significance of that is that while many Byzantine territories had been overrun, it was rare for them to officially recognize that those territories were lost and then grant a foreign power official recognized control of that area. So this was a huge setback for Constantine IV, and it had to be a pretty big disappointment coming on the heels of so many great successes, and it really had to dampen that spirit of making a great comeback that they had at this time. Despite the massive defeat that he had suffered at the hands of the Bulgars, it appears that Constantine IV's personal prestige was not really all that badly affected, and that he still had quite a bit of goodwill with the public. Now, up until 681, his younger brothers Tiberius and Heraclius were technically co-emperors, although they didn't really exercise anything like imperial authority. So in 681, Constantine took the opportunity to have his brothers removed from power and to secure the succession of his young son Justinian II. So he took his brothers, had them removed from office, and then had them mutilated by having their noses slit. And the thought at the time was that if your nose was slit, you would then be ineligible to hold office. This is something that was an innovation in the Heraclian period. And in 681, now that his brothers were gone, Constantine therefore elevated his son Justinian II to the status of co-emperor. So now the line of succession was secured. And the irony, of course, of making his brothers ineligible by slitting their noses is that a similar fate would befall his own son Justinian II, and he would simply ignore that custom and return to power. Unfortunately, we don't know very much about Constantine's last 4 years aside from his actions in securing the line of succession for his son Justinian. We can guess that he was in terrible health, though, and that he didn't do very much. He did suffer a heavy defeat at the hands of the Bulgars, as we already discussed, but that doesn't seem to have badly undermined his popularity. At least, so far as we can tell. Again, the evidence is pretty limited. If this mosaic on the screen is to be believed, then despite the fact that Constantine was only in his early 30s, his health was already completely gone, and he was a walking corpse. He died in September of 685 of dysentery, at least that's the official explanation. To me, if you just look at that mosaic, it looks a little more like cancer or something like that. And he was only 33 years old. He had reigned for about 17 years, and he had accomplished quite a bit. Had he been in better health and lived longer, who knows what he might have gone on to accomplish. So what is the legacy of Emperor Constantine IV? Well, on an institutional level, he continued to develop the thematic system. I don't remember which theme it was, but there is at least one theme that he personally founded. He also managed to restore religious unity to a reduced empire. While that would not be as great of a deed as restoring unity to a larger empire, still, it's an accomplishment, especially when you look at the history of Byzantine religion and how difficult it was to get all parties to reconcile around a shared belief. He's also, most significantly, the first emperor to preside over meaningful victories against the Arabs. So he proves that the Arabs can be beaten. And that's something that will really restore the morale of his empire and help them to put themselves on the road to recovery and rebuilding the empire. Unfortunately for Constantine IV, he is overshadowed by his great-grandfather Heraclius and by his son Justinian II, who were larger personalities, lived longer, reigned longer, and got themselves involved in more shenanigans. But Constantine IV was vital to Byzantine survival in the 7th century in his own right, and if we're talking about how the Byzantines came through this great crisis that was posed by the Arab invasions, no discussion of their survival is complete without at least some mention of Constantine IV and his accomplishments.